She was marrying my best friend, and I had spent 11 months convincing myself I was fine with that. Right up until the moment she looked at me across the dance floor at her own reception and said, quietly, almost too quiet to hear over the music, "It should have been you." I want to be honest about what that sentence did to me, because the easy version of this story would have me reacting with some kind of immediate clarity, some decisive next move, and that is not what happened. What happened is that I stood there holding 2 drinks I'd gone to get for myself and her new husband, completely frozen, while the woman who had just married my closest friend 2 hours earlier looked at me with an expression I had spent a decade trying not to recognize. I had no idea, standing on that dance floor, that the sentence she'd just said was going to unravel 11 months of careful denial in roughly 4 seconds, and that nothing about my friendship with Marcus or my understanding of the last decade was going to look the same after that night. Let me take you back to the beginning, because that sentence on the dance floor doesn't make any sense without understanding everything that came before it. My name is Jonah. I'm 33 years old. I work as an architect at a mid-sized firm downtown, and I've known Marcus since we were assigned as roommates our first year of college, the kind of accidental pairing that occasionally produces a friendship lasting far longer than either person originally expects. We were close in the unspectacular, durable way that good long friendships usually are. Not dramatic, not effortful, just consistently present across more than a decade of moves, jobs, breakups, and the slow accumulation of an adult life. I was his roommate for 2 years, the best man at his sister's wedding when his actual brother couldn't make the ceremony, the person he called at 2 in the morning when his father had a heart scare 3 years ago, and he was, in turn, exactly that same kind of steady presence for me. I want to establish clearly before anything else in this story that Marcus mattered to me in a way that very few people do. Everything that happened later happened despite that. Not because I valued it any less. I think it's worth describing briefly what kind of person Marcus actually was, because it matters for understanding why everything that follows felt so genuinely difficult rather than simple. He was the kind of friend who remembered small details other people forgot, the specific anniversary of a difficult event in your life, the fact that you preferred a particular coffee order, the name of a coworker you'd mentioned once in passing 6 months earlier. He showed up early to things. He called back within the hour. He had, in the years I'd known him, exactly 1 serious relationship before Elena, a difficult and prolonged breakup 2 years prior that had genuinely shaken something in him, the specific confidence of someone who had believed he understood his own life clearly and discovered, all at once, that he hadn't. Watching him rebuild that confidence, slowly, over the 2 years after that breakup, had been one of the quiet privileges of being his closest friend. I tell you this because it's important context for why. When Elena's name came up in his life only weeks after it had come up in mine, the calculation I made about what mattered more felt, at the time, far less selfish than it would look later. I met Elena the same way most people meet the people who end up mattering most. Accidentally, at a low-stakes gathering I almost didn't go to. It was a graduate school mixer 4 years before the wedding, hosted by a mutual friend neither Marcus nor I had particularly strong ties to, and I'd gone mostly because I had nothing else planned that Friday and a vague hope that something interesting might happen. Elena was standing near the drinks table looking faintly bored in the specific way of someone who'd come for one friend and was now stranded making small talk with strangers, and I struck up a conversation about nothing in particular. The terrible wine, the host's questionable taste in background music, and within 20 minutes, we were deep into a conversation that had nothing to do with either topic anymore. She was finishing a graduate program in urban planning, sharp and funny in a way that revealed itself slowly rather than performing itself immediately, the kind of humor that required you to actually listen instead of just waiting for the punchline. We talked for the better part of 2 hours that night, completely losing track of the party happening around us. And by the time I left, I had her number and a specific, unmistakable feeling that I had just met someone who was going to matter. I remember walking home that night replaying small fragments of the conversation. The way she'd described a disastrous internship the previous summer with a specific dry precision that made the whole story funnier than it had any right to be. The way she'd asked me real questions about my work, rather than the polite, glazed-over questions most strangers ask at parties. I remember thinking, somewhat unusually for me, that I wanted to remember this particular evening clearly, that something about it felt worth holding on to with more attention than a typical first conversation usually warranted. I called her 3 days later. We went on a first date that turned into a 4-hour dinner neither of us wanted to end. I want to be clear that this was, by every measure I had at the time, the beginning of something real, not a casual interest, not a passing attraction, but the specific, recognizable feeling of having found someone whose company felt less like an activity and more like a discovery every single time. We went on a second date. We were planning a third when Marcus mentioned, in passing, almost as an afterthought during a Tuesday phone call, that he'd met someone interesting at a friend's gathering the previous weekend. It took me several seconds to understand he was describing Elena. I remember exactly where I was standing when he said her name, in my kitchen, holding the phone with one hand and a coffee mug with the other, having just finished telling him, 30 seconds earlier, that I'd met someone interesting myself, deliberately vague about the details because I'd wanted to wait until after the third date to make it feel more real before sharing it. I had not yet said her name. He said it first, completely unaware, describing a laugh and a way of talking about urban planning that made me feel, in real time, the specific vertigo of watching two separate parts of your life collide without warning. I want to walk through the next part carefully, because it's the part I've turned over most in the years since, trying to determine exactly where the responsibility sat and exactly what I should have done differently. Marcus had met Elena at a different gathering, a separate friend group's overlap. A coincidental second meeting after our first date but before our planned third, and he had no idea I'd already met her, already gone out with her, already felt the specific, unmistakable thing I'd felt across that dinner table. He described her with the careful, hopeful enthusiasm of someone who'd recently met somebody promising, using almost the exact same words I would have used to describe her to him if our positions had been reversed. I had a choice in that moment that I did not handle well. I could have told him immediately, "This is the woman I went on a date with last week. This is someone I'm actively interested in. Please step back." It would have been awkward, but it would have been honest, and it would have prevented everything that followed. Instead, I said nothing. I told myself in the moment that it was a coincidence too strange to address cleanly over the phone, that I'd sort it out the next time we saw each other in person, that there was no immediate urgency requiring me to interrupt his enthusiasm with a complication. I told myself several other things, too, none of which, looking back, were anything other than excuses for avoiding a conversation I was afraid of having. I remember even rehearsing briefly how I might bring it up the next time we spoke, and then talking myself out of it before the call had even ended, telling myself there would be a better, clearer moment later. A moment that never actually arrived because I never actually looked for it with any real urgency. By the time Marcus and I actually saw each other in person, 4 days later he had already asked Elena out. She had already said yes. And when he told me this, glowing with the specific excited energy of someone who thinks his life might be about to get considerably better, I made the second bad decision in a short sequence of bad decisions. I let it go. I told him that sounded great. I did not mention the dinner, the 4 hours, the planned third date that I quietly canceled the following day with a vague excuse about being overwhelmed at work. I have spent a great deal of time since then trying to understand my own motivations in that moment, and the most honest answer I've arrived at is this. Marcus had been single for a long stretch after a difficult breakup 2 years earlier. The kind of breakup that had genuinely shaken his confidence, and watching him light up about someone new felt, in that specific moment, more important than my own quiet disappointment about a budding interest I'd known for less than 2 weeks. I told myself I was being generous. I told myself 2 dates didn't constitute a real claim on anything. I told myself a lot of things that were technically defensible and ultimately, I think, simply easier than the alternative. Elena and Marcus dated for the better part of a year before he proposed. I watched this happen from the close, complicated vantage point of being his best friend. Present for the relationship's early excitement. Present for the deepening of it. Present, eventually, for the proposal planning, all while carrying a private knowledge that I never disclosed to either of them. Elena never mentioned our brief overlap either, not in the early months, and I told myself this meant it genuinely hadn't mattered much to her. That 2 dates with someone 4 years ago barely registered against the relationship she was actually building. I want to be honest that I half believed this for most of that year, because believing it made everything considerably easier to carry. The proposal happened at a restaurant overlooking the river, the kind of carefully orchestrated romantic gesture Marcus had been planning for months, consulting me on details along the way, the ring, the timing, whether the restaurant's private room would feel too formal or exactly formal enough. I helped him plan his own proposal to a woman I had, 4 years earlier, gone on a date with and felt something for that I'd never fully examined or processed. I want you to understand how strange that specific position was to occupy, advising my closest friend on how to romance someone I had privately wondered about for years without ever giving myself permission to call it what it actually was. I remember sitting with him at his kitchen table the week before, looking at ring options on his laptop, offering genuine opinions about which one suited her, and feeling, the entire time, a specific low hum of dissonance that I refused to examine too closely. He asked me at one point, half joking, whether I thought she'd say yes. Of course she will, I told him, and I meant it, because I knew with a certainty that had nothing to do with hope exactly how she felt about him. That certainty didn't make the moment any easier to sit inside of. It just made it impossible to argue with. She said yes. I was, by all outward appearances, genuinely happy for both of them. And I want to be careful here because I don't think that happiness was entirely false. I did want good things for Marcus. I did think Elena was a remarkable person worth building a life around. And those feelings coexisted, uncomfortably, with something else I had never let myself name directly. The wedding planning stretched across 11 months. And during that time, Elena and I developed our own independent friendship. The natural consequence of being thrown together repeatedly through Marcus, dinners, planning sessions, the specific overlapping social orbit that happens when your best friend marries someone you'll now be connected to indefinitely. I want to be honest that this friendship had a charge to it that I noticed and chose not to examine, conversations that went slightly longer than necessary. Moments of eye contact that lingered a half-second past comfortable. An ease between us that occasionally felt like more than the ease of simply being your best friend's fiancé and his oldest friend. There was an evening, maybe 6 months into the engagement, when Marcus had to work late and Elena and I ended up finishing a venue walkthrough alone, the coordinator having left us with a checklist and a set of decisions that technically required Marcus's input, but practically just needed someone present to make them. We sat in the venue's empty garden afterward, sharing a bottle of wine the coordinator had left behind, talking long past the point where the conversation had any reasonable connection to wedding logistics. She told me about her father, about a complicated relationship she was still working through, even as she planned to marry into a family that seemed, by contrast, almost effortlessly warm. I told her things about my own family I rarely told anyone, the specific defensive humor I used to deflect any real conversation about my parents' divorce when I was 12. We sat there long enough that the light changed twice, and when we finally left, neither of us mentioned how long we'd stayed or how little of it had actually been about the wedding. I told myself, every single time I noticed this charge, that I was imagining it, that any tension was entirely on my side, and entirely a product of my own unresolved feelings rather than anything genuinely shared between us. I became, over those 11 months, extremely skilled at this particular kind of self-deception, noticing something real and immediately constructing an explanation that made it safe to ignore. The wedding itself was, by every objective measure, beautiful, an outdoor ceremony in late September, the specific golden light of early autumn, 2 people who clearly loved each other standing in front of everyone who mattered to them and making it official. I gave a best man speech that I'd worked on for weeks. Careful and warm and completely honest in every detail except the one detail I never mentioned. The detail that would have required explaining a version of events neither of them fully knew about. I told stories about Marcus's loyalty, about watching him become the kind of person capable of building something this solid, and I meant every word of it, even while carrying the specific, complicated weight of everything I'd never said. I remember standing at the podium that afternoon, looking out at the seated crowd, finding Marcus's face first, and then, despite every effort not to, Elena's beside him, both of them looking back at me with open, trusting expressions that had no idea what I was actually carrying as I spoke. I got through the speech without my voice betraying anything, which felt at the time like its own small private achievement, a decade of practice at compartmentalizing exactly this kind of feeling, finally proving useful for something. The reception moved into the evening. The specific loosening that happens once the formal parts of a wedding conclude and people simply start enjoying themselves, dancing, drinking, the band finding its rhythm, the night settling into something easier than the structured tension of the ceremony itself. I had been dancing with various people throughout the evening, the obligatory rounds of a best man working the room. And at some point, well past most guests' first or second drink, I ended up on the dance floor across from Elena during a slower song, the kind where couples naturally pair off and the wedding party simply fills in the gaps. We danced for a few minutes without saying much, the easy, comfortable silence we'd developed over 11 months of overlapping friendship. And I remember thinking, even in that moment, how strange it was that this particular silence had never felt entirely comfortable, that there was always something underneath it I was actively working to ignore. I went to get drinks for both of us partway through the song, an excuse to step away that had less to do with actual thirst and more to do with a specific instinct that something in the silence between us had started to feel like more weight than I knew how to carry on a dance floor. When I came back with 2 glasses, she was standing slightly apart from the crowd, watching me approach with an expression I had spent a decade actively avoiding the recognition of. "It should have been you," she said, quiet enough that the words barely cleared the music, looking directly at me with an expression that had stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. I stood there holding 2 drinks, completely frozen, the entire weight of 11 months, of 4 years really if I was being honest with myself, collapsing into that single sentence. "What do you mean?" I said, which was a coward's question, because I understood exactly what she meant the moment she said it. "I know about the date," she said. "Before Marcus. I found out about 6 months into dating him. A mutual friend mentioned it in passing. Completely unaware it would mean anything. And I never said anything because by then I was already in deep, already building something, and it felt unfair to both of you to bring it up. But I've thought about it more than I should have, especially recently. I think about what would have happened if you'd just told him. If you'd told me even. I think about it more than I'm supposed to. Given that I got married 2 hours ago, I felt something in my chest do a complicated thing I didn't have a clean name for. Relief that I wasn't the only one carrying this. Devastation that we were having this exact conversation on her wedding night, and underneath both of those, a specific, undeniable confirmation of something I had spent a decade telling myself wasn't real. "I should have told him," I said. "I knew that at the time, and I did it anyway. I let myself believe it didn't matter enough to disrupt anything." "Why didn't you?" I thought about the most honest answer, the one I'd avoided giving myself for years. "Because I was scared of what it would mean if it did matter," I said. It was easier to let it become nothing than to find out it might have been something significant, and lose Marcus's friendship over it regardless of how things turned out. "That's a very reasonable thing to be afraid of," she said. "I don't think it makes what happened less complicated, but I don't think you're a villain for it either. I want you to know I've never thought that." She was quiet for a moment, the music continuing around us, other couples swaying nearby, completely unaware that the 2 of us were having the most honest conversation either of us had had in years. "Can I ask you something else?" she said. "Of course. Do you regret it?" "Not telling him." I turned the question over before answering because it deserved an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. I regret the version of myself who decided silence was easier than honesty, I said. I don't know if I regret the actual outcome, because the outcome includes Marcus being happy, and that's not nothing to me. I think I regret the process more than the result. Does that make sense? It makes more sense than I expected it to, she said. I don't know what I'm asking you, she said finally. I'm not asking you to do anything. I just needed to say it once, out loud, to the person it was actually about, instead of carrying it silently for the rest of my marriage like it doesn't exist. I understand, I said, and I meant it, though understanding didn't make the moment any less complicated to stand inside of. I love Marcus, she said, and I believed her completely without any doubt. That's real. What I'm telling you doesn't undo that. But I think some part of me needed you to know that the timing was the only thing that decided this. Not anything about who either of you actually was. We stood there for a long moment, the unfinished drink still in my hands, neither of us moving to rejoin the reception immediately. The music had shifted to something faster, other couples filling the floor around us, and I remember registering distantly that the world was continuing on, completely unaware of how much had just shifted in the small space between us. I think, I said eventually, we both need to agree that this conversation happened exactly once, and that it doesn't get to happen again. Not because it wasn't real. Because it has to not be real now, for both your sake and Marcus's. She nodded slowly. I know, she said. I knew that before I said anything. I think I just needed permission to have said it at all. I left the wedding that night, carrying something I hadn't carried in 11 months. The dangerous mixture of confirmation and impossibility. The specific knowledge that something had genuinely been real, and the equally specific knowledge that its reality changed absolutely nothing about what needed to happen next. Marcus and Elena went on their honeymoon 2 days later. I went back to my ordinary life, my job, my apartment, the specific quiet of being 33 and carrying a secret that could never be spoken again without doing real damage to people I genuinely loved. It has been 3 years since that wedding. And the story does not end where I thought it would end that night, standing on the dance floor with 2 drinks going warm in my hands. Marcus and Elena had a daughter 18 months into their marriage, and for a while everything looked, from the outside, exactly like the life they'd built it to be. The house, the routines, the specific accumulated texture of 2 people raising a child together. But somewhere in that second year, the thing I'd noticed at the wedding, the charge between Elena and me that I'd spent 11 months explaining away, found its mirror in something Marcus had started noticing too. Not about us specifically, but about himself. A slow, honest recognition that he had built a marriage around the right person for the wrong reasons. That he had loved Elena genuinely, but had also, in some part of himself he'd never fully examined, been running from the aftermath of his earlier breakup. Building something solid mostly because solid felt safe after years of feeling otherwise. He told me this himself, almost a year after the wedding, sitting in my apartment on an ordinary Tuesday, turning a glass of water slowly on my kitchen table the way he did when something mattered enough to need a prop to hold on to. I think I married her because she was wonderful and available, and I was tired of being alone, he said. Both of those things are true. I don't think either of them is enough, on its own, to build an entire life around, and I think some part of both of us has known that for a while without saying it. What does that mean you're going to do? I asked, genuinely uncertain, my own complicated history with this exact subject sitting silently between us in a way he had no idea about. I don't know yet, he said. I think we're going to try to talk honestly about it before anything more dramatic happens. I owe her that. I owe myself that too, I think. After a year of pretending the quiet unease I keep feeling is just normal married life adjustment instead of something more specific. I sat with that for a long moment. The specific guilt of someone who had information that might have been relevant years earlier and had chosen, then and now, not to disclose it. Do you think it's something specific about Elena? I asked carefully. Or something more about where you were when you met her? He considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things that actually mattered to him. I think it's the second one, he said. I don't think she did anything wrong. I think I walked into this relationship needing it to work more than I needed it to actually be right, and those aren't the same thing, even though they can look identical from the outside for a surprisingly long time. I didn't tell him in that conversation about the dance floor. I want to be clear that what happened next wasn't the result of any scheme or confession on my part. Marcus and Elena's marriage ended, slowly and then decisively, over the better part of a year, through their own honest reckoning with what they'd actually built versus what they'd told themselves they were building. It was sad in the specific, unglamorous way good marriages sometimes end. Not through betrayal, but through two people gradually admitting that comfort and love are not always the same thing, and that they had mistaken one for the other. I stayed out of it as much as I genuinely could. The closest friend to both of them, watching a marriage I had quietly complicated years earlier dissolve for reasons that, as far as I could tell, had nothing directly to do with me. Marcus moved out eventually, amicably. The two of them committed to raising their daughter together, despite no longer being a couple, and I watched my best friend rebuild a life on terms that were, for the first time since I'd known him, entirely his own rather than a reaction to whatever had come before. I want to be honest that the separation was not, for either of them, an easy or painless process, even handled as well as it possibly could have been. There were months where Marcus stayed with me, sleeping on the same couch he'd once helped me move into this apartment, working through the specific grief of ending something that had genuinely held love in it, even if it hadn't held the whole truth. I watched him grieve a marriage that had, by his own honest account, been built on real affection, just not on the deepest version of himself. And I found myself, more than once during that period, sitting with a complicated guilt I never voiced to him, wondering how much of what he was grieving traced back in some indirect way to a phone call I'd let pass in silence years earlier. It was almost 2 years after the wedding, nearly a year into the separation, when Elena and I had dinner together for the first time without Marcus present, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for their daughter's upcoming birthday, the kind of practical logistics that had become a normal part of how the three of us now related to each other. We talked for 3 hours, the conversation drifting eventually from logistics into something more honest, and at some point, without either of us deciding to bring it up directly, she said, "I think about that night at the wedding sometimes. I've wondered if it was the first true thing either of us said in years." "I think it might have been," I said. "I'm not the same person I was at that wedding," she said. "I don't think you are either." I'm not saying this to pick up where a sentence left off 3 years ago. I'm saying it because I think we both owe it to ourselves to actually find out what this could have been. Now, slowly, without anyone getting hurt by it. We took that slowly, deliberately, in a way that honored both Marcus's friendship and the specific, complicated history that had brought Elena and me to this point. A year of careful, honest conversations, of making sure Marcus was genuinely at peace with where things were heading before either of us let it become anything official, of building something this time with none of the silence that had defined the first 4 years. That year of waiting was harder than I expected it to be, in the specific way that doing the right thing slowly is almost always harder than doing the wrong thing quickly. We saw each other regularly during that stretch. Co-parenting logistics gave us a legitimate reason to be in contact, and we used those occasions honestly, never pretending the practical conversation was the whole reason we kept finding excuses to extend dinner by another hour. We talked about what we actually wanted, separately from each other, before we let ourselves talk about it together. What it would mean for her daughter, what it would mean for Marcus, whether either of us could live with the specific complicated optics of how this would look to anyone who didn't understand the full history. I told her, more than once during that year, that I would rather wait 2 more years and do this honestly than rush it and damage something none of us could repair. She told me just as often that she'd already waited 4 years without meaning to, and that a little more patience, done right this time, felt like the least either of us owed everyone involved. Marcus, when we finally told him, took it with a grace that confirmed everything I'd always believed about who he actually was, not instant ease, not without some real complicated feeling to work through, but ultimately, after some weeks of necessary distance, A genuine acceptance that surprised even him. I think some part of me always knew, he told me. Months later, the three of us having found our way to a new, different kind of equilibrium. Not the old friendship exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that had room for what Elena and I had become. I don't think I'm angry exactly. I think I'm glad neither of you said anything back then, because if you had, I don't think I'd have the daughter I have now, and I can't actually wish any version of this away that doesn't include her. Elena and I have been together for a year now. We are careful, deliberate, attentive to the specific, complicated history that brought us here, and neither of us takes for granted the fact that this almost didn't happen, that an entire decade nearly passed with the truth permanently folded back into silence. Marcus is still, against every reasonable expectation I might have had standing on that dance floor 3 years ago, my closest friend. Different now, more honest. Built on an understanding none of us could have managed back when everyone was still protecting a version of the truth, too fragile to say out loud. We have dinner together, the three of us and his daughter, often enough now that it no longer feels remarkable. Just the ordinary shape of a family that reorganized itself rather than broke apart. Marcus has started seeing someone new in the last few months. A woman named Priya, who works in the same building as his office. And I find myself genuinely rooting for that relationship with none of the complicated undertow that once accompanied everything to do with his romantic life. I think more than anything, what I feel watching him build something new is relief. Relief that he gets to start again on terms that are actually his own. Relief that the eventual unraveling of his marriage, painful as it was, gave him back a version of himself he might never have found otherwise. I think about that wedding night often. The specific weight of a sentence I assumed, at the time, was something I'd carry silently for the rest of my life. I was wrong about that as it turns out, though I had no way of knowing it then. Sometimes the truths you're most afraid to speak are the ones that, given enough time and enough honesty from everyone involved, eventually find their way to where they were always supposed to land. Not through scheming or shortcuts, but through people slowly becoming brave enough to want something real, more than they want to keep protecting. Something that was never quite true to begin. With Elena still teases me sometimes about the too warm. Drinks I carried back to that dance floor and never actually delivered. Both glasses abandoned somewhere on a side table while we had the conversation that, however delayed, eventually became the foundation of everything that came after. I tell her I think about those drinks more than I probably should. The small, specific detail my memory kept when everything else about that night could have blurred together into a single, overwhelming feeling. She tells me that's the most romantic thing I've ever said about warm wine. I tell her she's not wrong, and we let it be exactly that simple, finally, after a decade of nothing about this being simple at all.